Imagine this: you wake up one morning and realize that every moral impulse you've ever felt, every moment of guilt that kept you awake at night, every fear of judgment that made you hesitate before speaking your truth, none of it was truly yours. The voice in your head that whispers, "You should," and "you shouldn't," sounds like your conscience, but what if I told you it was installed there, carefully, deliberately, across generations, by the most sophisticated architecture of control ever constructed by human hands? Picture a prison where the inmates guard themselves. Where the bars are invisible, woven from beliefs so ancient they feel like instinct. Where punishment requires no executioner because the condemned willingly inflict it upon themselves. Where freedom is available at any moment, yet the prisoners defend their captivity with religious fervor, quite literally. Today, we begin a journey to uncover how religion across history evolved into the greatest control system humanity has ever known. And I promise you this: the final revelation of this journey will be the most unsettling and transformative of all. This channel exists for those who dare to think deeply. For those who feel that beneath traditions, doctrines, and moral commands, there is something more complex, more human, and more psychological at work. We draw from philosophers, psychologists, historians, and critical thinkers who are not afraid to ask dangerous questions. Questions about power, belief, fear, and meaning. This is not about attacking faith, but about understanding its structure, its function, and its influence on human behavior and society. Before we go any further, if content like this resonates with you, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, share this video with someone who enjoys deep reflection, and comment your thoughts along the way. What we will reveal here may fundamentally change how you see religion, authority, and even yourself. Religion did not begin as a tool of control. That is a crucial point. In its earliest forms, religious belief emerged as a response to fear, uncertainty, and the overwhelming mystery of existence. Early humans faced death, natural disasters, disease, and cosmic forces they could not understand. They needed stories that transformed terror into purpose, chaos into meaning. But here's the critical shift that changed everything: once belief systems became shared, organized, and institutionalized, they gained power. And where there is power, control inevitably follows. Consider the strangeness of this: across continents and centuries, billions of human beings have willingly surrendered their autonomy to systems claiming divine authority. They've accepted moral codes they never agreed to examine. They've internalized prohibitions against their own nature. They've lived in fear of invisible consequences and arranged their entire existence around appeasing forces whose evidence rests solely on inherited testimony. Wars have been waged, civilizations have risen and fallen, and countless individuals have sublimated their deepest desires, all in service to doctrines that resist scrutiny by design. But here's what makes this truly unsettling: when you point this out, when you suggest that perhaps these belief systems function as mechanisms of behavioral control, the response is rarely thoughtful consideration. Instead, you encounter something more primal: defensiveness, anger, fear. Not because the observation is false, but because it threatens something far more fundamental than belief. It threatens identity itself. When control becomes indistinguishable from self, criticism feels like annihilation. Ask yourself, how many of your deepest convictions did you choose after rigorous examination? How many were simply there when you became conscious enough to notice them, already embedded in your psychology like native code in software? And more disturbingly, how many beliefs do you defend not because you verified their truth, but because abandoning them would require rebuilding your entire sense of who you are? This is the paradox at the heart of religious control: it doesn't feel like control. It feels like truth, like morality, like salvation itself. The most effective chains are the ones you cannot see, the ones you mistake for your own skeleton. And religion, across its countless manifestations, perfected this art over millennia, transforming external authority into internal compulsion so complete that the controlled become the most passionate defenders of their own containment. Think about the psychological genius of this system. Political tyranny must maintain force. Economic oppression requires ongoing inequality. But religious control? It perpetuates itself through the very minds it constrains. It turns parents into enforcers, teaching their children to internalize the same constraints. It transforms communities into surveillance networks where deviation is policed not by authorities but by peers. It makes the act of questioning feel not like curiosity but like sin. So we stand at a precipice of uncomfortable questions. If the moral frameworks that govern our civilization are inherited rather than chosen, what does that mean for our claims of free will? If our deepest sense of right and wrong was programmed into us before we developed the capacity to consent, are we truly moral beings, or merely obedient ones? And most troubling of all, if we've been controlled all along, why does the possibility of freedom feel not like liberation but like terror? What follows is not an attack on faith, but an excavation of structure. An attempt to understand how belief transforms into control, how control disguises itself as virtue, and how the human psyche became both prison and prisoner. The transformation of religion from personal belief into organized authority did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly across generations, like water shaping stone. As populations grew, societies required structure, laws, and shared values. Religion stepped naturally into this role, offering not only spiritual explanations but social order. What began as guidance gradually became governance. And in that shift, something profound was lost, something most people never noticed was taken. The moment religious figures positioned themselves as intermediaries between humanity and the divine, a chasm opened in human consciousness. Access to truth was no longer universal. It was mediated. The priest, the prophet, the cleric became the gatekeeper of meaning. Max Weber described this as the institutionalization of charisma, when spiritual authority hardens into bureaucracy. Once this happens, questioning doctrine is no longer curiosity. It becomes disobedience. And disobedience, when the authority is divine, is not merely error, it is sin. Notice how devastatingly effective this structure becomes. Political rulers govern bodies. Religious rulers govern minds. When these two forces merge, resistance becomes nearly impossible. Throughout history, kings ruled by divine right. Emperors were crowned by religious authorities. Dissenters were not merely traitors but heretics. The punishment was not only death but eternal damnation. Power on earth fused seamlessly with fear beyond death, creating a control mechanism that operated across dimensions, visible and invisible, temporal and eternal. Psychologically, this fusion exploits humanity's deepest vulnerabilities. Carl Jung observed that the human psyche seeks meaning as naturally as the body seeks air. We are pattern-seeking creatures, desperate to find order in chaos, purpose in suffering. Religion offered this meaning wholesale, prepackaged, ready-made, requiring only acceptance. But acceptance came with a price, the surrender of individual judgment. When meaning is provided rather than discovered, the muscle of autonomous thinking atrophies. Over generations, entire populations learn to receive truth rather than seek it. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that systems claiming absolute truth often disguise a will to dominate. His concept of slave morality describes how religious institutions inverted natural human impulses, reframing weakness as virtue and obedience as strength. The meek shall inherit the earth, a beautiful sentiment, perhaps, but also a mechanism for pacifying those with legitimate grievances. When suffering is sanctified, when endurance becomes holiness, revolution becomes blasphemy. The oppressed learn to endure rather than resist, to accept rather than transform. But perhaps the most insidious element in this architecture of control is guilt. Guilt is not simply a feeling, it is a mechanism of self-regulation. When religion defines natural human impulses as sinful, it creates a permanent state of internal conflict. Desire becomes shame. Curiosity becomes temptation. Doubt becomes moral failure. Sigmund Freud observed that civilization is built on repression, but religion intensifies this repression by moralizing it. You are not merely imperfect, you are fallen. Born tainted. Inherently corrupt. And only obedience can redeem you. This internalization of control is far more efficient than external force. You do not need guards when people monitor their own thoughts. You do not need chains when fear lives inside the mind. The concept of an all-seeing deity ensures that even private thoughts feel exposed. The individual becomes both prisoner and guard, judge and condemned. Michel Foucault explained that power is most effective when it becomes invisible, when people internalize it and police themselves. Religion achieved this with remarkable efficiency by embedding surveillance not in institutions but in conscience itself. Yet the most underestimated weapon of religious control is not fear but hope. The promise of salvation, paradise, enlightenment, or eternal peace creates tolerance for suffering that would otherwise be intolerable. When pain is reframed as meaningful, as temporary, as a test or purification, resistance dissolves. Karl Marx famously described religion as the opiate of the masses, not as an insult, but as an observation. Opiates numb pain. They make unbearable conditions survivable. If suffering is temporary and reward is eternal, injustice can persist indefinitely. Ask yourself, why do so many belief systems emphasize endurance over transformation? Why is obedience praised more than understanding? Why does humility so often mean silence? When systems teach that the world is fundamentally broken and salvation lies elsewhere, in heaven, in the afterlife, in the next reincarnation, attention is redirected away from present injustice. Control does not require cruelty when people willingly accept their position as divinely assigned. This is the hidden problem beneath the surface of religious devotion, a transfer of agency so complete that it feels like grace. At this stage, we must confront mechanisms even more subtle than fear, guilt, or hope, mechanisms that operate beneath conscious awareness, reshaping not just what we believe but how we think. The unseen consequences of religious control manifest not in dramatic conversions or public rituals, but in the quiet architecture of the mind itself. They appear in the questions we never ask, the thoughts we abort before they fully form, the boundaries we accept without ever testing their validity. Moral absolutism is perhaps the most powerful of these invisible constraints. When a belief system claims ultimate authority over what is right and wrong, it does not merely guide behavior, it ends discussion. Once morality is declared sacred, ethical reasoning becomes unnecessary and, in some cases, even dangerous. The philosopher Immanuel Kant believed morality should arise from reason and autonomy, from the individual's capacity to think through ethical principles. Religion, when absolutized, reverses this process entirely. Morality no longer comes from reflection. It comes from submission. This is how critical thinking is slowly neutralized across generations. Questions are tolerated only within approved boundaries. Curiosity is welcomed until it challenges doctrine. Beyond that point, inquiry becomes rebellion. History is filled with examples of thinkers silenced, exiled, or executed, not because they lacked intelligence or morality, but because they thought independently. From Giordano Bruno burned at the stake for astronomical theories, to Baruch Spinoza excommunicated for philosophical inquiry, the crime was not immorality but unauthorized thought. Psychologically, this creates what modern researchers call cognitive closure, a mental state where ambiguity becomes intolerable. Humans have a natural discomfort with uncertainty. We evolved in environments where quick decisions meant survival, where hesitation could be fatal. Religion exploits this neurological vulnerability by offering clear answers to existence's most complex questions. Where did we come from? Why do we suffer? What happens after death? These answers may be emotionally satisfying, but satisfaction is not the same as truth. Over time, certainty becomes addictive. Doubt feels threatening not because it is false, but because it destabilizes the entire structure of identity. Consider how obedience is systematically reframed as virtue. Humility often means silence. Faith often means acceptance without evidence. Trust often means surrendering judgment to authority. The more obedient the individual, the more morally superior they are perceived to be. This inversion is crucial to understand. Strength becomes weakness, questioning becomes arrogance, submission becomes righteousness. The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned that great evils are often committed not by monsters but by ordinary people who stop thinking. Religion, when functioning as a control system, does not require cruelty. It requires compliance. Another powerful yet invisible mechanism is ritual repetition. Repeated prayers, chants, confessions, and ceremonies are not merely symbolic acts, they condition the mind at a neurological level. Neuroscience demonstrates that repetition reinforces neural pathways, making certain thought patterns automatic. Over time, beliefs stop being evaluated and start being reflexive. Words are spoken without reflection. Gestures performed without awareness. Identity fuses with habit until the two become indistinguishable. This is why leaving a belief system often feels physically uncomfortable, as if the body itself resists freedom. Community pressure further strengthens this invisible structure. Humans are social beings. Our brains are wired for belonging. Exclusion threatens survival at a primal level that predates rational thought. Religious systems understand this deeply and exploit it masterfully. Belonging is conditional. Acceptance depends on alignment. The fear of social exile becomes a silent enforcer more powerful than any external authority. Even when doubts arise, they are suppressed to preserve connection. The individual learns that honesty may cost love, while silence guarantees safety. Now we arrive at a paradox that reveals the true depth of religious control's consequences. Many religious teachings speak explicitly of love, compassion, and peace. Yet history reveals cycle after cycle of violence, oppression, and division justified in their names. This contradiction is not accidental or the result of mere human failure. When an ideology claims moral perfection, any action taken to defend it becomes automatically justified. Violence becomes sacred duty. Intolerance becomes protection of truth. The ends are sanctified by divine approval, placing them beyond ethical scrutiny. The psychologist Eric Fromm distinguished between humanistic religion, which nurtures growth, autonomy, and self-realization, and authoritarian religion, which demands obedience and submission. Control systems thrive in the latter. They do not ask who you are becoming. They ask only whether you comply. They do not encourage self-discovery. They reward conformity. And the consequences of this arrangement ripple through entire civilizations, shaping laws, gender roles, social hierarchies, and the boundaries of acceptable thought. The most unsettling realization is this: these consequences remain largely invisible because they have become normal. The cage is mistaken for the natural shape of existence itself. At this critical juncture, we must confront an uncomfortable truth: recognizing the cage is not the same as escaping it. Understanding how religious control operates does not automatically dissolve its power over the psyche. The rebellion against internalized authority is not a single act of defiance but a continuous practice of reclaiming what was surrendered, often before you were old enough to know it could be kept. The first and most radical step is accepting responsibility for your own meaning. This sounds simple, perhaps even obvious, but its implications are profound and destabilizing. When you stop outsourcing truth to external authorities, when you cease waiting for doctrine to tell you what is right, tradition to tell you what is possible, or sacred texts to tell you who you are, you inherit a burden that organized religion was designed to carry for you. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that humans are condemned to freedom, meaning we cannot escape the weight of choice, the necessity of self-definition. Religion offers relief from this burden by providing prepackaged answers. To break free is to reclaim that burden willingly. This requires developing what philosophers call intellectual autonomy, the capacity to think for yourself, not in opposition to others, but independent of the need for their approval. It means asking questions without predetermined answers. It means tolerating ambiguity without rushing to certainty. It means sitting with doubt long enough to examine whether your beliefs are truly yours or merely inherited. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus taught that freedom begins when you distinguish between what is within your control and what is not. You cannot control the doctrines you were taught as a child, but you can control whether you continue to accept them without examination. History offers us models of those who broke free, often at tremendous personal cost. Baruch Spinoza was excommunicated from his Jewish community at age 23 for questioning religious dogma. He lost his inheritance, his family, his social world. Yet he continued thinking independently, eventually developing a philosophy that treated religion as a human creation worthy of study but not blind obedience. His writings were banned, condemned, and burned. But his ideas survived because they were built on reason rather than authority. Spinoza's rebellion was not against spirituality itself but against the demand that spirituality must come with submission. Similarly, the Buddha, born into religious tradition, rejected the authority of Vedic scriptures and the Brahmin priests who claimed exclusive access to spiritual truth. His path was radical precisely because it centered on direct experience and personal investigation. Do not believe something simply because it has been passed down, he taught. Do not believe something simply because many accept it. Find out for yourself what is true. This principle, direct inquiry over inherited belief, is the foundation of intellectual freedom. Breaking free also requires recognizing and dismantling the emotional mechanisms that keep control invisible. Fear must be examined, not obeyed. When you feel afraid to question a belief, that fear itself becomes the most important thing to investigate. Where does it come from? Is it protecting you from genuine harm, or is it protecting the belief system from examination? Guilt must be distinguished from conscience. Guilt imposed by external doctrine is not the same as the internal recognition that you've caused harm. One is a tool of control, the other is a guide toward ethical behavior. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, who survived Nazi concentration camps, observed that meaning cannot be given, it must be discovered through personal engagement with existence. His logotherapy is built on the principle that humans need meaning more than comfort, and that authentic meaning comes from taking responsibility for one's choices and values. This directly contradicts religious systems that provide meaning ready-made, requiring only acceptance. Frankl's insight points toward a different kind of spiritual life, one where meaning is earned through honest confrontation with reality rather than inherited through obedience. Practical rebellion involves several concrete practices. First, examine the beliefs you hold with the same skepticism you would apply to beliefs you reject. Ask, what evidence supports this? What would convince me I was wrong? If nothing could convince you otherwise, you're not holding a belief, you're defending an identity. Second, cultivate doubt as a skill rather than fearing it as a flaw. Doubt is not the opposite of faith, it is the beginning of honest inquiry. Third, build communities based on shared curiosity rather than shared certainty. Find others who value questions over answers, growth over conformity. Most importantly, understand that breaking free does not mean rejecting all spiritual experience or transcendent meaning. It means refusing to let those experiences be interpreted for you by authorities claiming divine mandate. Carl Jung spent his life studying religious symbols and believed they pointed toward deep psychological truths, but truths about the human psyche, not commands from the sky. When interpreted literally and enforced as absolute law, religious symbols control. When interpreted psychologically and held as maps of inner terrain, they liberate. The rebellion, then, is not destruction but transformation, moving from obedience to understanding, from inherited belief to examined conviction, from fear-based morality to conscious ethics. Now we reach the deepest and most decisive layer of this entire journey, the point where the true nature of control reveals itself not as an external force imposed by institutions, but as an internal agreement sustained by the individual. This is the revelation promised at the beginning, and it will be uncomfortable. The most powerful control system in history does not survive because it coerces humanity. It survives because humanity, often unconsciously, participates in its own containment. At the core of religious control lies a transfer of responsibility so complete that most people never recognize it has occurred. Meaning, morality, purpose, and truth are outsourced to external authorities. When answers are given before questions are fully formed, when doctrine preempts inquiry, the individual is relieved of the burden of existential responsibility. And here is what must be understood, this relief feels like grace. It feels like being cared for, guided, protected from the terrifying vastness of existence. The cage feels like sanctuary. Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of bad faith describes this precisely, the human tendency to deny our own freedom, to pretend we have no choice when in fact we are always choosing. We choose to accept inherited beliefs. We choose to stop questioning. We choose to surrender our judgment to authority. But we disguise these choices as necessities, as duties, as divine commands beyond our control. This self-deception is not imposed from outside. It is something we do to ourselves because freedom, true freedom, is terrifying. This is why the final mechanism of control is not fear of punishment or hope of reward, but dependency. Dependency on authority to tell you who you are. Dependency on doctrine to tell you what is right. Dependency on tradition to tell you what is possible. Once this dependency is established, freedom feels dangerous rather than desirable. Responsibility feels overwhelming rather than empowering. Doubt feels like collapse rather than curiosity. The individual becomes addicted to certainty, and like all addictions, the thought of withdrawal triggers panic. Observe how deeply this runs through human psychology. Even when religious claims are questioned intellectually, emotional attachment often remains intact. The rituals feel meaningful. The language feels sacred. The moral narratives feel true at a level deeper than logic. The sense of being guided by something greater feels irreplaceable. These elements become psychological scaffolding, remove them without building alternative structures of meaning, and the self feels it might collapse entirely. This explains why many individuals who leave organized religion do not immediately feel liberated. They feel lost, disoriented, anxious, not because freedom is harmful, but because they were never taught how to carry it. Control systems rarely teach self-trust. They teach obedience. They rarely teach moral reasoning. They teach rule following. They rarely teach meaning creation. They teach meaning reception. The result is populations of people who have been trained since childhood to look outside themselves for answers to questions that can only be answered from within. Who am I? What matters? How should I live? These are not questions doctrine can answer for you, they are questions only you can answer through the act of living deliberately. The historian Yuval Noah Harari has pointed out that shared myths are the foundation of large-scale human cooperation. Religion is one of the most successful myths ever created, not because it is entirely false, but because it is emotionally compelling and socially reinforcing. Humans needed these stories to build civilizations, to coordinate behavior across vast populations, to create shared values. The danger arises not from myth itself, but when myth is mistaken for unquestionable reality, when symbolic truth is enforced as literal law, when the stories meant to serve humanity become the masters demanding service. At this level of understanding, the question shifts fundamentally. It is no longer, has religion controlled humanity? History makes that answer clear. The real question becomes, why does control feel preferable to freedom for so many? And the answer is both simple and devastating: control promises safety. Freedom offers uncertainty. Control offers certainty. Freedom offers growth. Control offers belonging without effort. Freedom demands courage. And courage is rare, not because humans lack strength, but because they have been systematically conditioned to doubt themselves, to distrust their own judgment, to believe that without external authority they will descend into chaos. This conditioning is the final and deepest layer of control, the belief that you are insufficient without it. That your nature is corrupt and requires external correction. That your thoughts cannot be trusted. That your desires are inherently suspect. That you need to be saved from yourself. Once this belief takes root, the individual becomes the most effective enforcer of their own limitation. They do not need to be controlled from outside because they have internalized the controller. They have become both prisoner and guard. Yet here is where the ultimate truth emerges, the one that changes everything once fully grasped: the same consciousness that was conditioned can be reconditioned. The same mind that learned to doubt itself can learn to trust itself. The same person who inherited meaning can create meaning. The capacity for authentic freedom has always existed within you. It was never actually taken, it was only obscured, covered over by layers of doctrine and fear and inherited belief. But it remains, waiting. This does not mean spirituality, wonder, or transcendence must be abandoned. Carl Jung spent his life exploring religious symbols and concluded they are profoundly meaningful, but as maps of the psyche, not commands from the sky. Religious imagery points inward toward psychological truths about human nature, the unconscious, the process of individuation and self-realization. When interpreted literally and enforced as absolute external law, these symbols control. When interpreted psychologically and engaged with as internal guidance, they liberate. The future of human consciousness does not depend on destroying religion but on outgrowing its authoritarian forms. On moving from obedience to understanding. From inherited belief to examined conviction. From fear-based morality to conscious ethics. From external authority to internal responsibility. This transition is not easy, it destabilizes identity, dissolves certainty, demands intellectual honesty and emotional resilience. But it also restores something essential that was traded away: dignity, agency, the capacity to think, choose, and create meaning without permission. So the final question, the one that determines everything, is not whether religion controlled humanity. The question is whether you, individually, are ready to outgrow the need for that control. Whether you are willing to stand in uncertainty without surrendering your judgment. Whether meaning can be built rather than received, earned rather than inherited, chosen rather than accepted. Whether you can carry the weight of your own freedom. Ask yourself this, and reflect deeply: if no authority was watching, no doctrine judging, no reward promised, no punishment threatened, if you stood alone with only your conscience and your capacity for reason, what kind of human being would you choose to become? That answer, more than any belief system, scripture, or tradition, determines not only who you are but what humanity can become. The greatest control system in history succeeded not by deceiving people but by answering genuine needs while quietly limiting human potential. It answered fear instead of dissolving it. It replaced self-knowledge with submission. It transformed existential anxiety into obedience. But the moment you recognize this, truly recognize it, the system loses its invisibility. And what cannot be seen cannot control you the same way again. The cage door was never locked. You were always free to walk through it. The only question that remains is whether you will.